The very last session of today. We have the pleasure of hearing Veronica Gago and Sandro Mezzadra. The name of this last session is, the title is Le marxisme global d'Antonio Negri. So, Antonio Negri, Global Marxism. This session will be held in English. So, for again, ceux parmi vous qui parlent pas anglais, une traduction en français est disponible encore une fois dans vos écouteurs. And I think that none of them needs a presentation, but just to okay, but we can do it as well. So, Veronica Gago teaches political science at the University of Buenos Aires and critical theory and gender theory at the Universidad Nacional de San Martín. And she, yeah, I'm merging all the languages. Sorry. And she is an independent researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Research, also part of the Group for Feminist Research and Intervention. She is the author of some well-renowned books in the tradition of Marxist feminism, like Neoliberalism from Below, Popular Pragmatics and Baroque Economies, and Feminist International. Sandro Mezzadra teaches political philosophy at the University of Bologna, and she's also a well-known scholar of Toni Negri's thought and contemporary Marxism. Among his most recent books, The Politics of Operations, Excavating Contemporary Capitalism with Brett Nielsen, and the very most recent book is The West and the Rest, Capital and Power in a Multipolar World, again with Brett Nielsen. I'll let them the stage. So the first intervention will be Veronica's, if you agree. And the title of her intervention is Exploitation and Extraction, Revisiting Toni Negri's Concepts from the Feminist Social Reproduction Perspective. And then Sandro will hold an intervention whose title is Deception to be Destroyed, State, Sovereignty, and Constitution in Toni Negri's Work. After their intervention, there will be, of course, a space for questions and debates with the public. We have more or less half an hour, but I mean, since it's the last session of the day, we will have more margins for managing the debate. Thank you, and I let you the stage. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, especially to the organizers. It has been a very long day, but very inspiring and moving readings and memories. So I moved too. I think that the title is too ambitious, that this is not really, I think, what I will do. Rather, I will present a very brief exercise of reading Toni's text in relation to the feminist strike. So it is with Toni and beyond, as all of us are doing here. So I also want to thanks to Eric and Anik, because I am here also as a part of International Chair of Philosophy of Paris 8. So thanks for having me here. In a text by Toni that I discovered recently, dedicated to the abstract strike. This is what I want to comment. And I was once again struck, as I was reading Toni's text for the first time, by his power of anticipation. Of course, that is part of his method, detecting tendencies where everything seems closed and lost. But above all, I want to reclaim the effect of surprise as a gift of his writing, which, quoting Kafka, consists of finding a way out where there is none. Encontrar una salida donde no la hay. I don't want to repeat now what I said in occasion of the 20 years of Empire, but reading Toni for me, and when I say Toni, I said a constellation of persons, comrades that we name when we name Toni. It is embedded in my political and intellectual work in Argentina in at least the two last decades. So my reading is completely affected and affective in this trajectory. But I was saying that I was surprised again by Toni's reading of the notion of the strike. And I quote him when he writes, "The algorithm is, as Marx used to say, a machine that runs where there has been a strike, where there has been resistance or a rupture in the valorization process, a machine produced by the same strength and autonomy expressed by living labor." So the big difference between the labor processes Marx studied and those of today consists of the fact that today cooperation is no longer imposed by the boss, but produced from within the labor force. Thinking about the algorithm, Toni forces us to read the intensification of the history of technical and technological innovations as counter-revolutions. But I insist, radicalize as reasoning in the sense that those innovations are increasingly indistinguishable from social cooperation. That is, from a new level of autonomy. I think that is really counterintuitive if we think in the algorithm as a new level of autonomy. And I like very much this effect of counterintuitive reading that we have when we read Toni, and especially when we have to teach or discuss Toni. From my perspective, this is not a way of ontologizing a notion of victory in the face of historical defeats. And I know that this is a sort of understanding of the critique of his Spinozism. Instead, I read it as a method that is useful for understanding how the counter-revolution operates, and above all, a way of not allowing the energy and organization that we have put into struggles to be expropriated. Seeing the counter-revolution as made up of our expropriated force, our captured words, our inverted critiques, I think it is a so useful, critical, and militant method and a gesture of vitality and justice for figuring out how to continue, where to go, precisely where there is no way out. This short text about the abstract strike, written as notes and presented in Venice in 2015, briefly proposes the notion of extractive exploitation of social cooperation. It forces us, again, to ask, first of all, about the connection between extractivism and exploitation. And second, what does abstraction and extraction against collective and cooperation invention mean? The connection between these 2 points is key here, which is the point that I want to emphasize: the non-disjunctive elaboration between exploitation and extraction. This is also the core of what I worked on in a text with Sandro, published in 2017, about rethinking extractivism beyond the literal dynamic of so-called natural resource extraction. There we pose the question of how to radicalize the notion of extractivism itself in order first to signal its organic relation to finance, and second, to go beyond a sectoral limitation to raw materials. Conceptualizing extraction in an expanded sense serves, at least in Latin America, is very clear, to delineate some key features of the operations of capital in this moment. And again, I think, in particular, to understand this moment of counter-revolution. In that sense, expanded extractivism is a formula that can account for the action of multiple financial devices in different territories, which extract value from a social vitality and cooperation that they do not contribute to organizing. Sandro and Brett have dedicated a whole book to that topic. I have followed another path, a path to think the connection between extraction and exploitation from the point of view and from the experience of the feminist strike. The question could be, could a feminist strike be abstract? This is a way to dialogue with Toni's text, or should be against abstraction. The reinvention of the strike as a tool is something that we debated as the actions were taking place over the last 10 years. Strikes are a collective epistemic process in which the capacity to shoot the world down is updated, as well as a space for pedagogical and political strategy in deciding how to narrate and express what is taking place. They are how we translate our actions into organizational power in everyday life. There is a history, I think, to be written on the political program of transfeminist strikes, one that examines how these actions have debated and elaborated demands and collective understandings of domestic work, pensions, the trans labor quota, public and household debt, housing and rent, migrant labor, comprehensive sexual education, reproductive justice, land ownership, the food and agriculture model, welfare benefits for single parent household, anti-prison work, as well as union organization in the context of social reproduction. This political program is a response to systemic understanding of the interconnected violences of patriarchal and colonial capitalism, where the conjunction of extraction and exploitation is a key to understanding this assemblage. I want to underline the knowledge accumulated through this cycle of struggles, applied collective intelligence, and the elaboration of political programs as a non-abstract response to that connection between exploitation and extraction. I want to connect with Toni's discussion about, of course, in different texts, but in this text about the strike in particular, the production of subjectivity. He argues that these productions occurs by means of subjectivation, while at the same time, the workers must be constantly reduced to a commanded subject. When I refer to feminist strike, I want to underline a cycle of struggles that have been highly networked. It had cut transversally across issues, and it have been able to produce multiple variations and changes in how we organize. I think this is crucial for thinking about the variation of the strike. This is another concept that Toni put in that text. In that sense, Toni offers two possible points of entry to this formula of variation. First, the social strike, the figure of the strike against the capitalist techniques of extraction of value from entire society. I think it's too abstract. Second, a very much concrete question. How can the strike be situated in processes in which the reproduction of society intersects with financial capital, with the process of monetization? I think that we can propose from regions like Latin America and Argentina in particular, processes of the financialization of social reproduction, going, for example, into debt to pay for social reproduction. Toni raised a question that serves as a guideline. Where does the abstract strike become a materialist strike? Here, I think the strike hits the ground of social reproduction, but also I'm thinking of the impact of feminist strikes and mobilizations on indigenous and working class strikes in Ecuador, 2019 and 2022, on the national strike and uprising in Colombia, 2019 and 2021, and on the sequence that runs from the feminist strike to the social uprising in Chile, 2019 and 2020. To name the most obvious examples, this interweaving, which exhibits a range of temporalities, different temporalities, implies a deepening and organic connection with popular anti-racist and anti-extractivist forms of protest. To this, we can, of course, add the conflicting but evident influence of these same processes in the presidential elections in Argentina 2019, Chile 2021, Brazil 2022, and Colombia 2022. I can summarize what we might call organizational innovations in the processes in which feminist strike and feminist demonstrations integrate, expand, and engage that produce concrete variations also in the strike. Changes in spokespersonships, including feminist and queer leadership. Changes in how the task and infrastructure for the social reproduction of struggles, and in particular for ways of occupying the streets, are valued. Reconsiderations of systemic violence by exploring the meaning of war against certain bodies and certain territories, an explicit refusal to allow movements to be isolated by their agendas or disconnected from increasingly broad mobilizations. Changes in the collective understanding of gender-based violence as a structural expression of capitalist and colonial violence. In rereading movements, statements, texts, and events of this past decade, we can notice the emergence of a new dynamic that is at once process-oriented and disruptive, and which seeks to constantly expand political alliances, processes of translation, political translations, and the resonances of organizational forms. So the intensification of the paradox between abstraction of command and strike finds a key moment in the feminist perspective and practice. Why? Due to the way in which the encounter between exploitation and extraction is organized without being about to detach itself from the centrality of bodies and territories. Toni argues that now the boss is financial capital, which extracts social value. Here it is strategic, the moment of articulation that requires the versatility of devices of financialization, which function as forms of translation of increasingly heterogeneous realities in an attempt to synchronize them toward valorization, while also proposing a novel and peculiar relation with the social in general under distinct modes of exploitations of the vital. Toni says, the novelty is that the financial prototype allows a direct relationship between capital and destruction of value, producing the image of an end to mediation, and even a production of money through money that does not need to pass through a social relation with capital's other, that is, to use one of Marx's categories, with living labor. Social reproduction, in fact, I think, confronts this fantasy of the end of mediation. From the perspective of social reproduction struggles in the strike and beyond the feminist strike, the acceleration of economic violence through financial extractivism finds in the platforms its favorite means. Here, a greater problem emerges as an open question, which has, I think, especially been raised by feminist movements. What are the political tools of protest and negotiation of a labor force that lies in the intersection between financial and platform capitalism, also in our region, and non-guaranteed social reproduction. The feminist strike is an exercise not to answer these questions, rather to expand it. Toni also argues that finance capital is presented as dictatorship, not in the sense of a fascist dictatorship, certainly, but as an abstraction of command and its governmental standardization in the effort to assert its authority over the abstraction process. We can say, in other words, financial capital is what makes abstraction coincide with extraction. Maybe today we have to rethink this formula, taking into account the way in which the authoritarian dimension of the financial capital has been organizing itself, even especially since the pandemic. This reorganization, thinking, for example, from Argentina, can be summarized in a key concept of the anarcho-capitalist government that we have. The concept is financial freedom. That is a key concept of the moment that we are going through. During the pandemic, an acceleration of financial real estate extractivism took place that especially targets women, lesbian, travestis, trans people, non-binary people, and migrant and racialized populations, and produces predatory speculation around housing, evictions, and debt. Then we saw a reconfiguration of the articulation between the financialization of everyday life and platform economies, and also popular platform economies, which seek to claim the home, community, social spaces, and the most precarious work, paid and unpaid, as sites for extractions of resources and energy. These changes are key to understanding the pandemic as a setting of a new threshold for economic and financial violence, one which is intertwined with an intensification of gender-based violence and which has not relented since. The pandemic and its still present ramifications amplifies the space of social reproduction in an unprecedented way, revealing the infrastructure that sustains collective life, the territories and bodies involved, and the precarity they endure. It also explores how these spaces and practices became politicized in response to neoliberal crisis from a trans-feminist popular perspective. Based on the uses of category of essential work that became popular during the pandemic, we can map a paradoxical reclassification of the crisis of wage labor and a tendency toward the intensification of work that is less recognized as such and which is increasingly moralized and criminalized. Terrains of social reproduction with the different types and spaces, social reproduction is not an homogeneous category, are now a strategic entry point for the counter-revolution because that is where disobedience has expanded, intervened in and reconfigured other struggles. I'm thinking in labor struggles, public services struggles, housing struggles, popular movement struggles that I was quoting before, and where tensions connected to freedom and care came together. Just to finish, I am trying to think now around the notion of fascistization of social reproduction, also in dialogue with Silvia Federici, in order to understand the simultaneous dynamic of impoverishment and exploitation of social reproduction, which leads to the emergence of modes of management using tools that accelerate especially financial violence. In Argentina, that financial violence has become a means of radicalizing authoritarianism or authoritarian neoliberalism towards fascism. It is not a fascist dictatorship, as Toni said, but it's a modality of fascism accelerated through the notion of financial freedom. Financial freedom that is presented as the inverse double of women, lesbian, travestis, migrant people who go into debt to sustain social reproduction, radicalizes an authoritarianism which proposes transitioning from the status of entrepreneurs to becoming speculators for survival. It is also a promise, the current sacrifice that the government nowadays offers to support austerity measures, for example, will transmute into investment in the future. This is the promise of financial freedom. This financial offer responds, of course, to the destabilization caused by labor precarity, itself the result of decades of neoliberalism, but is especially against the expanded processes of politicization of social reproduction, where the feminist strike has a very crucial role. Financial freedom could be read as the abstract response against the transversality that the feminist and popular struggles have built in the last decade at least. I return to finish to the beginning. To read Toni beyond Toni is to look for a way out where there is no one. Thank you.
La persona. La persona. No hay salida, hay que buscar. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. But above all, thank you for organizing this meeting. And this is not rhetorical. This is not simply a conference. It is rather a political space where we foster relations of friendship, political complicity, where we pursue what Toni, in his autobiography, calls the art of subversion. An art of subversion, he writes, that crosses oceans and generations. I like to think of this meeting as in these terms. Let me say that when I read again the abstract that I sent for my talk tonight, I also realized that it was too ambitious. So I tried to scale down my ambitions, talking about the state, the way in which Toni worked on the state since the early 1960s is indeed a challenge. I would like to start from the end, from one of Toni's last writings, where he says that if someone asks him what the best book is to start with as an introduction to Marxism, his answer is clear. It is State and Revolution by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. But why? Is it because of the emphasis on class domination in Lenin's analysis of the state? I do not think this is the case. In his decades-long engagement with the state, Toni was far from simply repeating Lenin analysis of the state and from reproducing its shortcomings. I think we have to shift our perspective in order to understand the meaning of Toni's statement. What matters more for him in State and Revolution is the second term that figures in the title, which means revolution. And revolution methodically provides for him the viewpoint, the only possible viewpoint for a Marxist theory of the state. And the driving force of revolution is, for Toni, the communist desire to organize life and social cooperation against and beyond the state. Seeing how the state works is grasping what it is, Toni writes in 1970, mobilizing the notion of alienation, not one of his preferred Marxian concepts, to cast the state as a deception to be destroyed. Toward the end of the 1970s, he repeats the point, maintaining that, I quote, communism is the opposite of constitutionalism. The important point is that we must always read such negative statements that are consistent with the communist theory of the abolition of the state from the angle, from the point of view of their positive content, of the affirmative and constitutive politics they are meant to enhance. Let us stay for a moment with Lenin's State and Revolution. In his Factory of Strategy, 33 Lessons on Lenin, Toni provides a concise but conceptually dense and illuminating definition of the state as, I quote again, a specific form of the synthesis between organization and command. This definition nicely summarizes Toni's engagement with legal and constitutional theories in the previous years and foreshadows a very original interpretation of Lenin's project in 1917. Lenin's reduction of the state to its repressive logic and institutions to the side of command was meant, according to Toni, to separate from them the element of organization and to reconstruct the corresponding institutions according to the new norms produced by the proletarian struggle for liberation. And this is a powerful instance of a politics freed from the state, from a state that needs to be historicized and qualified as the modern state. As Toni explains in an essay of 1967, and then in his book on Descartes, the state emerged in Europe from the defeat of the revolutionary project of the Renaissance, taking the shape of a machine. And Toni emphasizes very much the homology between the machine state and the capitalist mode of production. And this homology, Toni writes, lays the groundwork for the social hegemony of the bourgeoisie. The state will undergo endless metamorphoses in the following centuries, but Toni could repeat Marx's words in the 18th Brumaire, all upheavals perfected this machinery instead of destroying it. While the state was able to steadily capture politics and the political, Toni's project, I want to repeat it, was to liberate communist politics from the grip of the modern state. And this is what he means when he maintains in Insurgencies, Il Potere Costituente, that constituent power is the definition of any possible paradigm of the political, beyond the state and beyond constitutionalism. Allow me to hark back to the definition of the state as a synthesis between organization and command, which is clearly influenced by the work of German constitutional historians like Otto von Gierke and Otto Inze, as well as by legal theories distinguishing the state as community and the state as apparatus. We should keep this in mind when considering Toni's position within Marxist debates on the capitalist state in the 1970s. It is indeed a very peculiar position with a double root. The first one is certainly his masterful command of European legal and constitutional theories, which is so apparent in two long essays written in 1964 on labor in the Constitution and on the position of political parties within the state. The second route is, of course, a reading of Marx forged by the participation in the radical worker struggles of the 1960s in Italy and by the related emergence of operaismo. You will agree that this combination is quite unique and provides an effective entry point into Toni's work even beyond the 1960s and 70s. For now, just consider one of the paradigmatic controversies that shaped Marxist debates on the state in the 1970s, the controversy between Ralph Miliband and Nikos Poulantzas. Without delving into the details, let us take the standard and indeed questionable rendering of the debate in terms of an opposition between an instrumentalist and a structuralist approach to the capitalist state and its relative autonomy. Toni acknowledges in his La Forma Stato, 1977, that the controversy between Miliband and Poulantzas revolves around a correct awareness of what he calls the elements of the new material consistency of the contemporary state. However, he criticizes both Miliband and Poulantzas for failing to recognize the constitutive role of class antagonism as the primary methodic criterion of a Marxist theory of the state and a Marxist critique of law. This emphasis on the primacy of class antagonism and struggle leads Toni, first of all, to focus his analysis not on the side of command, but rather on the side of organization in the constitution of the state. And this is another original aspect of his work. You know, from the essay on labor in the Constitution to the one on Keynes and the capitalist theory of the state, Toni provides a forceful analysis of the ways in which the state, after the October Revolution and in the framework of industrial mass production, was compelled to acknowledge in the West the power of labor. And this acknowledgement was at the same time a mystification, since it took the form of a confirmation of the prevailing capitalist norm of abstract labor. But the attempt to take the dialectic between collective capital and social labor as the basis for a new quality of capitalist development implies momentous transformations of the state beyond the rule of law and laissez-faire, whose new procedural and processual nature both registers the power of worker struggles and opens new spaces for them. The foundation of law, Toni writes in 1964, is the mutability, the articulation, and the continually new configuration of the conflictuality, which leads him to talk of a paradoxical capitalist Aufheben, dialectical recuperation of the permanent revolution. So this is a situation in which the gap between material and formal constitution appears to be under erasure. And it is precisely in such a situation that capitalist planning becomes not only possible, but also necessary, facing a socialization and constitutionalizing of labor that correspond to a socialization of class antagonism, as Toni writes, at its highest level. So the capitalist state becomes a plenar state, stato piano, to manage the new rational and relational cohesion of the nexus factory society. As a synthesis of capital's command and organization of its dialectic with social labor, the plan tends to posit itself as I quote, law of the social process, establishing rigid determinations for development. But this element of rigidity within the very structure of the planar state corresponds for Toni to its profound instability due to the steady growth of a class struggle that the constitutionalizing of labor makes internal to the state. And so Toni's work after 1968 is entirely focused on a description of the crisis of the planar state in terms of the emergence and consolidation of a fundamental asymmetry within its constitution. In other words, it was the power of worker struggles, their expansion beyond the walls of the factory, their connection with the insurgency of new proletarian subjectivities that exploded any dialectic between collective capital and social labor, opening unprecedented vistas of revolutionary action. So new issues from state spending to criminal law, and new interlocutors from James O'Connor to Klaus Hoffe and Johannes Agnoli populate Toni's writings on the state in the 1970s. His method becomes even more focused on the primacy of class struggle in an attempt to discover within juridical forms and political structures the intensity of antagonism, the profile of dominated and exploited subjects that legal abstractions and institutional arrangements struggle to contain and discipline. So since the early 1970s, Toni has been describing the crisis of the planar state, which is also the crisis of what Etienne Balibar has termed the national social state. What matters more for Toni, and this foreshadows the development of his philosophical reflections in the following decades, is the interruption of any dialectic and the separation of the new working class from all reformist and constitutional mediation. His critique of dialectic takes the political form of a project of proletarian self-valorization predicated on destabilization of the capitalist regime and concomitant destructuration of the capital's system. This was a political wager, a political bet on the possibility of revolution in an advanced capitalist country in the 1970s. And there would be much to say on that wager, as well as on the issues of organization, dualism of power, and political action it raised. But for today, I would like to conclude by discussing a concept that Toni used in his analysis of the crisis of the plenaire state, and which took center stage for a few years following his arrest in 1979, the concept of crisis state, stato crisi. Allow me to say that although Toni's writings on this concept are fragmentary, they offer really relevant insights for the genealogical understanding of some of the most pressing issues of our present. So what is the crisis state? It is a state that internalizes the separation produced by workers and social struggles, turning this separation produced by class struggle into a vector to recompose the state's capacity for command and its ability to facilitate the accumulation of capital. Crises become internal to the state, and its continuous management reshape the rationality of government. The deepening of the characteristics of the crisis state, Toni writes in 1980, announces the final rupture of the determinations of the social contract for development. This is a quote. This implies a radical crisis of democracy understood as, I quote again, the constitutional regime, liberal or socialist, in which power structurally lies in a relation between capitalist development and the development of workers and proletarian struggles. The rupture, Toni concludes in Macchina Tempo, is institutionally registered within a specific relation of power, of force, on the side of capital. The interruption of the dialectic between capital and labor is now unilaterally claimed by capital, which translates it onto a tendential erasure of any mediation. This may have sounded kind of unilateral diagnosis in 1980. And the same may be true for Toni's reference to the parallel, beyond any logic of historical analogy, between the crisis state and fascism, which is also predicated, Toni writes in the same book in 1980, on the use of crisis as institutional form of capital's command. So maybe this could sound unilateral in 1980, but what about today when we are confronted with the vanishing of any form of mediation for social conflict and with the related emergence of new forms of fascism in many parts of the world? In his The Subversive 70s, Michael also discusses what he calls the end of mediation as a kind of political awareness that emerged from the experiences of the movements of that decade within and beyond the West, as an anticipation of the neoliberal hegemony in the making. And Michael rightly cautions us that the end of mediation must be considered he writes, as a tendency, not an absolute fact. But we must recognize, I think, that that tendency has become more and more entrenched in the following decades, manifesting itself with full force today. But there is more to say about the concept of crisis state. Since the early 1970s, Toni had started to emphasize the relevance of a new relationship between the state and the capitalist corporation against the background of the crisis of the planner state. In 1974, he sketches a process of reorganization of capital led by multinational corporations at the level of the world market after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. The crisis state, he adds, appears today also as a crisis of the nation state with respect to the corporate form, to the multinational corporation form of capital's command. Some years later, in a book written in jail, Il comunismo e la guerra, Communism and War, he emphasizes what he calls the multinational constitution of capital and points to the world government of currency as a crucial terrain of struggle for the years to come. Allow me to say that this early awareness of the relevance of the world market as horizon and reference for the analysis of the transformations of the state is another original aspect of Toni's work in the 1970s. And while it clearly foreshadows elements that will be fully developed in his collaborations with Michael, and in particular in Empire, I think they are methodically even more relevant for us today in a completely different historical and political conjuncture. So to conclude, there is much to learn from Toni's writings on the state, on the law, and on the constitution. While looking for a communist politics beyond and against the state, he has provided us with passionate analysis of the multiple ways in which antagonism and class struggle shape and steer the transformation of the state. In the last part of my talk, I emphasized the relevance of the notion of crisis state. I repeat, stato crisi, since it seems to me quite adequate to grasp at least some aspects of today's state in Europe and beyond. When Toni writes in 1980 that what turns the crisis state into an authoritarian mass state is the interiorization of the logic of emergency, is referring, I think, to more than just the Italian emergency legislation of the time. And to hark back to the terms employed in Factory of Strategy, is rather describing a process of separation of the moment of command from the moment of organization in the very constitution of the state. And he adds that the process of reorganization of command takes place at the multinational level. So to investigate this articulation or disarticulation of levels continues to be an important task for us today, although, I repeat, in completely different conditions. And the crisis of my mediation, bordering on fascism, that Toni identifies as a key feature of the crisis state, haunts the development of social struggles in many parts of the world, including Europe. To put it in the terms proposed 3 decades ago by Etienne Balibar, insurrectional politics does not seem to find any acknowledgement or dialectical mediation in constitutional politics. And this is a question Toni has reflected upon in his late years, most notably in his travels across and writings about Latin America. But this would be a topic for a different talk for tonight. I think I can stop here by saying that while we certainly must go beyond Negri, Toni will stay with us for the time to come with his writings and his communist life. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica and Sandro, for your extremely rich and thought-provoking interventions. And I will just leave the space for questions from the public. We have, as I told you earlier, some time to spend on a common and a collective debate on these interventions. And you can, of course, ask your questions in either English or French, and we will translate them if necessary, but I don't think it will be. And I don't see the microphone that should... okay. Okay, so we're ready? You prepared 4 3 questions before? Okay.
So yeah, thank you so much for your amazing talks. My question relates to the question of mediation, the crisis of mediation or the erasure of mediation in terms of collective capital and social labor. I think there's a sense in which contemporary capitalism is increasingly become non-Hegelian in terms of like erasure of mediations. And you mentioned also Michael Hart's writings on that in the 1970s. At the same time, I feel like precisely through the historically unprecedented expansion of capitalist social relations and the capitalist world market, spatial temporalities at the local, national, regional level are increasingly mediated through the world market. So we have non-mediation, but at the same time, different modes of mediation that is related to the world market. This is not just a philosophical question about mediation, but it has practical, strategic consequences if we want to take seriously the concept of mediation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we take a few more questions before letting the intervenants ask. Well,
yeah, thank you for both presentations. I had a question for Sandro Mezzadra. You said that Negri was criticizing the Miliband Poulantzas debate, and you were saying that he was emphasizing class struggle. So was he prefiguring the late Poulantzas critique of structuralist state theories? Yes, because it's basically it sounded like the same argument. But then you also said that Negri referred the German state derivation authors like Agnoli and all these people. So what's Negri's position in this transnational debate? And for Veronica, I had a question about how you relate the fascization of social reproduction to what's happening in the US since since the inauguration of Trump. Thank you.
yes, I also have a question for both of you. The first would be which is actually a question for both of you, literally, because I was wondering what are the relationships between this concept of the crisis state and anarcho-capitalism tendencies in Argentina and the US. I was wondering whether should we consider anarcho-capitalism tendencies like Elon Musk or Javier Milei as like an ideological cover and the first ideological legitimation and narrative for the crisis state, or are we facing rather an like a further extremization of the logics of the crisis state? And I was also thinking that it is a specific aspect of the state power that is waning away in this concept of crisis state, which are like, let's say, the mediation function of the state, but not at all what in France is called the fonction régalienne de l'État, that is like defense and police, etc. So there is a like a parallel process of enforcing of these latter functions and complete disappearing of the formers. Yeah.
Actually, I want to continue from the last question. What's the position you do have regarding these neo-fascism forms of politics that we are witnessing? If you think actually that which the role of the subject there, if they have achieved to create politics without a political subject that is mobilized, or in the contrary, if there is some kind of form of subjectivation. And I ask that also regarding the concept of abstract strike, because if the center, if we are, orbiting around the production of subjectivity, how we can explore the concept of abstract strike that implies somehow an abstract of the productions of ourselves. Well, thank you. And thank you both.
I think we can ask. Yeah, we can let. No, there's a form. Okay. No, but there will be a second round anyway. But yeah, sure. No, no, go away. Go along. Yeah, sure.
Hi, sorry. Thank you so much, and thank you both for the great talks. I have a small question to both speakers, and maybe it's a bit like it's about definitions and maybe a bit philosophical and I'm not sure about the practical side. I mean, I can see it, but I'm not going to develop it now. So for Veronica, I wanted to ask about, so you in the beginning, okay, I'll stand up. You in the beginning talked about the phrase was detecting tendencies where everything seems closed, but also keeping the effect of the surprise. So I wanted to just ask you, what do you think are how do you understand the interrelationships between tendency and the surprise? Because, I mean, the definition of a tendency and a surprise are in a way the opposite, right? So, yeah, so that is the question, which is connected to my other question, but I think to Sandro's talk, that which is connected to the communist desire to organize beyond the state in Negri's thoughts, or to liberate communist politics from the grip of the state command, or to liberate the constitutive power, right? So when we are talking about this, because you also mentioned this dualism of power, right? But is it that, so how would you maybe interpret this? Are we talking about the dualism of power, or are we talking about the fact that it is the kind of weakness itself of the constitutive power, or the weakness itself of the communist desire, that we have to deal with the state as it is now? So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I let you answer.
Well, thank you for great comments and questions. There are a lot. I think I will start from the last one about this contradiction between tendencies and surprise, that I think it's really a sort of provocation, but also a way of understanding this reading of tendencies as a non-teleological, abstract way of thinking of what is coming. So it is, I think, a way to maintain the idea of tendency, but also putting in the center the notion of class struggle. So I think that the effect of surprise is something that should be entangled with the idea of tendency, because it's also another way to think why we need political research, militant research, to analyze or to understand tendencies. It is not obvious, the tendencies. The tendencies are not natural. So I think that this connection between the surprise, that is a double sense of the surprise while you are reading Toni's text and you can feel this capacity of anticipation, but also how this anticipation is also connected with a sort of openness of, openness of the hypothesis, and particularly the political hypothesis. So it is, for me, a way of provocation in my form of reading this notion of tendency. About the idea of, well, the state and this anarcho-capitalist and crisis state, I wrote with a comrade, William Callison, analyzing what Millet is saying about the state, because he say, I am in the state to destroy the state. I am within the state in order to abolish the state. So we analyze how he's effectively capturing this Nikos Poulantzas statement of the 70s as part of a socialist statement or socialist programmatic of within and against the state as our position in order to, well, what Sandro was speaking about. And I think that it's very provocative and very important and very challenging to understand how Millet, as capitalist anarcho state theory, is organizing this idea of we are inside within the state in order to destroy the state. But also, for example, I was discussing with some comrades how he said the state is a rapist, for example. He used this phrase that it is, for example, also the same statement of las tesis. El violador eres tú, to indicate, to signal the state as a rapist. Well, Millet says the same in order to analyze the tax system of the state. So I think it is really shocking how he's recapturing, but also, yes, turning completely the sense of what we can say about the state. So it is so crucial to rethink this notion of state crisis and so on in this new conjuncture of fascism. So for me, it's, well, really, of course, crucial in this moment when the repression, of course, is also growing in our country. About the question of the subject and the abstract strike, I think, again, that is a way to think with Toni and against Toni this idea of abstract strike. But at the end of the text, he pointed out that an abstract strike is also a strike against consumerism and the production of needs and desires. That is a sort of abstract level of production of subjectivity. And I think that for me, it's interesting how to combine this abstract level of production of desire and needs in order to, well, concretize those production of needs and desire in relation to social reproduction. So I think that the abstraction and as a way to think or rethink the strike is again a provocation that we can take advantage of that. And finally, just a couple of words about the notion of mediation. We can discuss and analyze the end of mediation, and at the same time, I was trying to highlight this proliferation of financial devices that finally function as concrete mediations in everyday life. So I think that could be interesting also to compare and contrast this idea of erasure or end of mediations and the proliferation of these concrete devices to articulate, but also to mediate between financial capital and social reproduction.
I also start with the issue of mediation, and thank you, Montesa, for your question. When I speak of an end of mediation, I refer to the state, first of all, and to a specific constitution of the state built upon the necessity of mediation, the necessity of acknowledging, let's say, popular claims and struggles, to keep it very, very general. Of course, also from this point of view, we have to stress that we are talking about a tendency, a logic of the state. The law on free abortion that was obtained by the trans feminist movement in Argentina was a kind of acknowledgement and mediation. But it required millions and millions of people on the street for years. It required the deployment of a very huge social power. So, as a mediation, I think the end of mediation grasps some aspects of the operative logic of the contemporary state. Then there are a lot of mediations, of course, even within the state. There are corporative mediations. There are mediations with social and economic interests, There are financial mediations that are, of course, very important. I mean, there has been this idea of the financialization of social rights circulating over the last 2 decades. And the mediation of the world market is, for me, very, very important, is a crucial mediation, but it is a different kind of mediation. It's very important. It produces practical effects, but it is a different kind of mediation. Then regarding the controversy between Miliband and Poulantzas, you may be right, but Toni wrote on that controversy in 1974 and 1975, before the publication of Poulantzas' last book. And then, as far as I remember, it does not hark back to the question in following years. And the same is true with the debate about derivation, state derivation, that in Germany started in the second half of the 1970s. So if you read the chapters of La Forma Stato that are dedicated to reviews of communist state theory, Toni engages in long discussions of stomach-up state monopoly capitalism, but does not really tackle the question of derivation that was kind of information. With Agnoli, he had also personal and political relation. He was invited to Italy and he invited Toni to Germany. The main point was the use of the Marxian notion of total capital to make sense of the capitalist state, to put it in a nutshell, you know. Then, you know, the question of fascism, crisis state, contemporary formations of fascism. I would say that fascism is in the air, you know.
Not only.
Although no, but many people say you cannot say fascism because if you use the word fascism, you propose a historical analogy that doesn't work. I mean, I was just saying that I am not particularly passionate about this debate in the left on the word fascism. You know. But I say fascism is in the air because if I take, you know, the support for Trump, it is not very easy, you know, to say what is specifically fascism. I am sure that there is fascism in the air, but in order to come to grips with the peculiarity of the fascist aspects of the contemporary far right, I think we need to work a bit more. If you take a book, a classical book on historical fascism by Mosse, The Nationalization of the Masses, you know, it doesn't explain contemporary fascism in India, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Italy, in the US. In a way, historical fascism was a highly political phenomenon, you know. While the contemporary forms of fascism are more close to the side of capital than to the side of the state, you know. If you look at the composition of the contemporary fascist crowd, you know, you see that it is quite difficult to imagine the existence of such crowds without digital platforms, you know. And I think this makes, of course, a difference with respect to historical fascism. And then again, if I think of fascism, I think of, you know, what Giovanni Gentile, the Italian fascist philosopher, called statolatria, no? The cult of the state. While today you say about Milei, he wants to destroy the state. Bolsonaro said something similar, but also Trump in a way against the administrative state. It is clear that the perspective today is not the perspective of a statification of society, economy, and culture that was at least the perspective of Italian fascism in the 1920s and 30s. And so this is the reason why I say fascism is in the air, because we have to be a bit more specific about the characteristics of contemporary fascism and the reasons why we call contemporary expressions of the far right fascist. And then your question about a politics liberated from the state. I have to repeat something that maybe I said too quickly before. When Toni speaks of the state, he does not speak of power. You know, a politics liberated from the state is not a politics liberated from power. It is a politics liberated from a specific form of organization of power, a politics that requires the invention of other forms of power and in particular of other institutions, which is a point that Toni makes already in the 1970s, you know, and then he developed in his work on the common. And what you say about dualism of power is important. I think dualism of power, the notion of counter power, are kind of directions of thought and of practical political experimentation for the politics that goes beyond the state. And of course, you know, if you take Toni's writings in the 1970s, that was the abolition of the state, the destruction of the bourgeois state. You can imagine different forms of negotiation, let's put it so, with the established institutional arrangements. You know, you can imagine the possibility of you know, establishing and enhancing autonomous forms of power, autonomous institutions linked to the social movements that are capable to negotiate in different ways with the existing institutions. You know, this is definitely something Toni considered in the last years. At the end of my talk, I was referring to Latin America, you know, and Toni has been very often to Latin America since, you know, 2003, 2004, when he got his passport back. And he reflected a lot, for instance, in Bolivia, on the possibility of this kind of different relation between, let's say, movements and struggles on the one hand and existing state institutions on the other hand.
Yes, because I forgot about the questions too, about fascistization of social reproduction in Argentina and the relationship with Trump and USA. I think that could be, or we can think about Argentina as it is a common figure, but I will use it anyway, laboratory of fascism, because, for example, Elon Musk said explicitly that for the Dodge, for the efficiency government, yes, he took inspiration from the new ministry in Argentina, that is the Ministry of Transformation and Deregulation of the State. That is, I think, another important experimental institution of the far right in our country in relation to this idea of crisis of the state at the same time. I think that we are used to thinking Chile in 1973 as a laboratory of neoliberalism. And I think that we can think nowadays, for example, in Argentina as a sort of laboratory in a way that it is from the periphery that we can analyze this acceleration of authoritarian neoliberalism through or towards fascism. So I think that it is very important nowadays to analyze together Argentina and USA, not only because of the chainsaw and all these iconic politics and foreign politics that is Millet exporting, but also in concrete relationship of these institutional innovations, but also in terms of this acceleration from the periphery.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answers. And are there other questions from, maybe we can still take two of them, yeah, one of two, yeah.
Thank you very much for your talks. I have a question, probably the first part is a little bit more addressed to you, Sandro, but it is for sure also connected with your talk. That is to say, I think that probably we should also follow another important trajectory to which Toni contributed a lot. And probably with all its ambiguities and also with the possibility that this also paved the way for another approach starting with the end of the 90s and then with the project of empire and so on. You emphasized with right, Sandro, how important was this approach by Toni, where he emphasized the role of the class struggle and of the working class also in the analysis of the 20s, and also in these writings about Keynes that has to be read with his writings on Lenin. There are passages, wonderful passages, where he also says, I also see the objection that can be addressed when I try to describe, you know, the crisis of 1929, and then Keynes as a rejection, as a reaction to the Bolshevik revolution. But indeed, Taylorism and Fordism have been the answers to the avant-garde and the way to isolate the political avant-garde from the working class. This is absolutely quite important. But I think that what is also quite important in Negri is this trajectory that he described, in which, as was said by Carlo at the very beginning of this conference this morning, capitalism never stops to also produce marginalization, right? And so there was in the history of the 20th century precisely this emergence of another working class. And so a process in which the working class also struggled against the working class. I don't want to use this bad word of fragmentation, but a word of differentiation of the working class. That is to say, the emergence of new subjectivities. This is an approach and a contribution that is absolutely quite central in Toni, right? And in that sense, well, anti-racist movements and feminist movements. So this is absolutely important to sketch out this dissemination, this differentiation of the working class. Probably this also was the point, to my view, and this is the open question I would like to pose here on the floor, that will be the potential, but also to some extent the obstacle in his analysis, and also the point where the analysis will switch from a trajectory that was a very operaist, workerist trajectory, mass worker, operaio sociale, cognitive worker, you know, and then this other focal length where the category of multitude emerges. But the category of multitude is not in the same theoretical trajectory, to my point of view. The category of multitude will expand on another philosophical project. But the question is also a little bit fragmentary, you know. But the question is of if, you know, this transformation at some point will put Toni and Michael in a situation where they will say, probably this approach through a critique of the role of the state doesn't work anymore. And I'm thinking about that in the sense that probably the impact of the work of Michel Foucault on Toni will be very, very important at this point, to say that probably we have to assume that the binarity of the class struggle between state and working class doesn't work anymore. And we have to go to a point where we develop a plural a plural dimension of the conflict. And this will come probably with all its richness with the multitude category, but also probably with some theoretical problems with that. Yeah.
Other questions? There's one there.
It's just to add, in relation with the last question, what do you think that are the political and practical problems in the change that is produced passing from the tradition that put the class conflict in the center and the dualism that it's there too, to multitude. In relation with this text that the great Negri and Michael Hart, 20 years after Empire now, where they talk about class, multitude, class prime.
Thank you for your speech. I have a technical, perhaps technical question for Sandro. I recently read a paper, Toni, about Pachucanis. You read the probably, I'm sure. What do you think about that?
Jesus.
Okay, I don't know. Better about the category of law, not of state, which is more important in Pachucanes. And I think it's more important even now. In this, with Millet, the law is the property law, of course. The property laws is over the state. So tax is a rape. And he is right, because tax is a rape. No, that's true. Yes, in relationship with the property law, tax is rape. Okay, that's all. Yeah.
Michael.
Okay, it's just, I was just wondering, Veronica, I know you've written about this many times, but if you could give more what the feminist strike does practically, that, or maybe example of feminist strike, because you said that it intervenes in this question of abstraction and extraction and exploitation. It's something you've already written about, but I thought here would be useful to have the more concrete, maybe example.
Well, first of all, I will put it very bluntly. I don't think that Toni ever abandoned the principle of class struggle. He tested this principle. He worked the boundaries of class struggles and of class. But at least in his mind, he remained faithful to the primacy of class struggle that he kind of forged as a methodic principle in the 1960s with his fellow operaists. Then, of course, you can evaluate, the outcome of his testing of class struggle and class composition. But as far as I have known Toni, I have discussed with him, you know, for him, class struggle was always the main reference. And at the same time, class was a riddle, you know, had become a riddle. And this, you know, made testing necessary, made experimentation, theoretical and political experimentation necessary. And so this is also a way to start to reply on the question of the multitude. That, of course, led Toni, Michael in many directions, you know, according to this experimental spirit, let's put it so. I think you are right that in the 1980s, in particular, Toni problematized his own take on the state, on state and workers, the title of a famous book that came out in the early 1970s, Opera e Stato. But then, you know, when Toni and Michael write The Labor of Dionysus, the approach to the state is very consistent with his previous work in the 60s and in the 70s. So the English version includes the translation, not an easy work, of many chapters of La Forma Stato. And there is a clear kind of connection between the two. So I think that this experimentation with multiplicity, you know, was very important for Toni. It started in the 1980s. I guess Foucault had a very important role, and then it went on, you know. But it was, I repeat, an experimentation. Then the idea, you know, that there was a principle of domination embodied in the state was always kind of fait accompli for Toni. Fait accompli? C'est bon? No, il German, stavo passando in tedesco. And so, you know, I think this is also part, you know, of the crisis state, the stato crisi, that I described in terms of a separation between command and organization. This separation lays the groundwork for the blossoming of multiplicity. You know. But then there is the political problem of the effectiveness of the politics of multiplicity. And then the very important question, I had included one page on Pashukhanish, but then it was too long. The essay that Toni wrote on Pashukhanish in the early 1970s is an amazing essay, you know. And the interpretation of Pashukhanish, I think you are right. I mean, foreshadows in a way current developments, because he emphasizes very much the constitutive effect of private law. But my friend and comrade Giso has worked a lot on Pashukhanish. He has promoted and edited a new edition of Pashukhanish book. Toni was very happy about that.
Very briefly to answer Michael's question, that I think it is connected with this idea of multiplicity. That is the reason why I was mentioning this political program of pensions, of trans labor quota, of housing, how these connections of violences produces a concrete political program that is very multiple at one level, but at the same time very much connected with this politicization of social reproduction. So I think we can discuss and share different concrete examples. For example, the formation organization of concrete forms of self-defense against sexist violence as a practice inside the organization of the strike, but also how one of the political demands of the strike was the inclusion of social reproduction issues like housing in the unions, and also the connection between the unionized workers and the unionized of the popular economic workers. So I think this kind of very practical mapping of the heterogeneity of labor, but also producing at the same time very concrete demands to respond this re-acknowledgement of the assemblage of different violences. I think that was very much a momentum of the strike in this political, but also in this research element that is at the same time, I think, what is now the fascistization of social reproduction, attacking very directly.
Thank you again to Veronica and Sandro. And well, it's been a long day. I think we can call it a day. And just a few announcements. Well, one announcement and a technical communication. I would ask everybody to just give the headphones back to the organizers, because we just couldn't afford to lose them. And the second communication is that, well, tomorrow, of course, we will meet here at 9:30, and we will start with a third common session held by the members of the Séminaire Capitalisme Cognitif. 9:30, and then after we will continue with our sessions and panels. Thank you so much for today, and well, of course, see you all tomorrow to end this conference. Arrivo subito, così vado. Devo pisciare da mezz'ora. Ma lasciamo tutto qua. No. Io ci penso qua. No, lascio qui. Aspetta qui. Beh, comunque due paesi di termine. Tutto. Quello che hai registrato quello che hai spiegato. L'audio non è stato cosa? Questo glielo tolto dal...
No, è importante. No, no, volevo dire che stamattina quando è stato. No, no, penso non c'è. No, c'era nessuno. Forse è stato forse qualche computer ora ne parla qualche coscienza forse non entrare non so che ci sarà adesso adesso è una cosa però io vado poi domani sera dopo la testa le nuove leve no, niente, andiamo a vedere una pizza al bar e